I created a formula in cell B7 to get the total of all the numbers in column B. I'd also like to get the total of the numbers in column C. And to do that, I can create another formula, or I can copy the formula I already have to column C. To do that, I'll click in cell B7. I'll move the cursor until it becomes a black plus sign, depress the left mouse button, and drag to cell C7, release the mouse button, and there's my total for column C. I'll take a look at both formulas to see what happened when I copied the formula. Click in B7 and look up at the formula bar, and you can see that the cell references are B2 colon B6, which encompass all the numbers in column B. I'll click in cell C7 and look up at the formula bar, and you can see that B2 has become C2 and B6 has become C6. Now the formula encompasses all the numbers in column C. When I copied the formula from this cell to this cell, the cell references automatically change to reflect the formula's new location. When you copy a formula and the cell references change, the cell reference is called a relative cell reference. Not that you have to know that term, but that's just what it's called. Before I go on to the next section, I also want to get the total for each salesperson for weeks 1 and 2. To do that, I'll click in D2, and I'll go up to Editing and click the AutoSum button, and press Enter, and there's my total, and I'll move the cursor till it's a black plus sign, and drag down, and now I've got the total for each person for their 2 weeks' work. Now, by the way, drag and dropping a formula works great, but you should know that you can also copy and paste a formula from one location to the other. That comes in especially handy if you want to copy a formula from one cell to a cell that's not right next to it. I'll just give you an example. I'll delete this formula. I'll click here and right click and click Copy. Then I'll click where I want the formula to go, and I'll right click, and I have some paste options, and this one is formulas, which I want since I'm pasting a formula. I'll click, and there's my total again for column C, and to get rid of this marquee around cell B7, I'll press Escape. Next, you'll see a formula in which the cell reference does not change when it's copied from one cell to the other. Every 2 weeks, each salesperson gets a 3% commission for their 2 weeks' worth of work. I'm going to create a formula in which I can calculate what each person's commission will be. I'll type my rate, it's 3%, into cell F2, and it could be in any cell, that's just the cell I happen to pick. And then I'll type my formula here, equals, and then I want to get Buchanan's total into the formula, and I want to multiply that times the commission rate. And here's the commission rate. I'll click there, and I'll press Enter, and the commission rate is 43.45. Now I'm going to copy the formula, and you might be surprised by the result. Copy it down, and look, everyone else is getting zeros. Well, that's obviously not right. They should get a commission. Let's take a look at the formula and see why this has happened. If I click in E2 for Buchanan's commission, we see D2 times F2. Well, that's perfectly fine. This is D2 and that's times F2. But if I click here and look up at the formula bar, it says D3 times F3. Well, there's nothing in cell F3, so that's why we've got a 0. And of course, since cell references change when they're copied, F2 here became F3 when it was copied down, and then if we look again, it became F4. Well, and this is an example where, as great as it is that cell references can automatically change, we don't want it to change. So what I'm going to do is show you how to make that happen. I'll delete this. Well, actually, I'll delete the entire formula and just start over again. I'll type my equal sign. I'll click here to get D2 in again, and do my multiplication sign. I'll click here to get the commission rate. But this time I'm going to change the cell reference from being a relative cell reference that will change when copied to an absolute cell reference that will always point to cell F2. And absolute cell references look different than relative and you change it by pressing your F4 key. And now, this probably looks kind of strange, it does to me anyway. It says $F, $2, and that just means that this formula is always going to point to cell F2. By the way, if you forget the keyboard shortcut of F4, you can always type the dollar signs in yourself. And the dollar sign always goes before the column, so $F, and before the row, so $2. So I'll press enter, and there's my total, same as before. But this time, when I copy the formulas down, each person has their own sales commission. If I click in the cell here and look at it, we've got D3, and there's our absolute reference. It's pointing over here to cell F2. Click here, and again, the relative reference changed from D3 to D4, but that absolute reference still points to cell F2. Next, I'm going to show you another formula example where the cell references are kind of a combination of both relative and absolute. I want to build a table, and what the table will tell me is that based on how much someone sold, what their commission would be for those sales depending on what the commission rate is. To do this, I need to create a formula with cell references that are called mixed references, where part of the reference is absolute and part of the cell reference is relative. Now, I kind of had a hard time understanding this, but I eventually got it, and I hope I can make it a little bit easier for you. You generally would use a mixed cell reference in a table like this, either commission rates or say a tax rate table. I'll click here where I want to build my first formula, and what you have to ask yourself if you're building a table like this is, what do you want the formula to always point to be an absolute reference? Well, I always want to point to column B, where my sales rates are, and I always want the formula to point to row 2, where the commission rate is. So go ahead and type the formula, my equal sign. I'll click here to get 100,000 into the formula. Now I want to make column B into an absolute reference, so I'll press my F4 key, and that makes B3 an absolute reference, which is not what I want. I only want the column to be absolute. I'll press my F4 key again, and this time it's $3, which means that the row would be absolute, which isn't what I want. So I'll press F4 one last time, and I've got an absolute reference to column B, but a relative reference to row 3, which is what I want. The formula will always point to column B, but the relative part 3 will change as I copy down to say row 4 and row 5 and so on. Now I'll multiply times my sales commission, which I can't see right now. It's kind of obscured, so I'll just go ahead and type in C2. So I want to refer to row 2 all the time, so I'll press my F4 key, and everything's absolute. Don't want that. Press F4 again, and that's exactly what I want, which is a relative reference to column C, because I'll be copying to column D, E, and so on, but always pointing to row 2, the absolute reference. I'll press enter. We get $1,000 if we sell 100,000 and get a 1% commission. And I'll copy this into the next cells, and that all makes sense. If we get a 5% commission, we'd make 5,000. I'll select these because I want to copy the formula down all the way in the table. Release the mouse button, and there I've got my table. And if we click in any cell, say here in F10, if I sold 800,000 and happened to get a 4% commission, it'd be 32,000. And if we look up in the formula bar, we can see that we've got this absolute reference to column B, but we're in row 10 times. We happen to be in column F, but we're still pointing the formula to row 2. I click up here where I've sold 400,000 and get a 1% commission. It's 4,000. We look up here in the formula bar. We're pointing to column B. We happen to be on row 6 times. We happen to be in column C, and there's that absolute reference pointing to row 2. Next, you'll see some more functions.